Hello dear listeners, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. Edward here, so glad you've joined me again. Tell me, what's your favourite warm drink to enjoy while listening to these mysteries? Tea, cocoa, or perhaps a cosy cup of coffee? I love hearing about the small comforts that make your evening special, and of course do subscribe if you haven't already. Now, get comfortable, the mystery awaits. Chapter 1. A Stranger for Christmas. The village of Lochdub lay under a thick white blanket of snow, looking for all the world like one of those pretty Christmas cards that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the reality of a Highland winter. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood at the window of the police station, his hazel eyes surveying the scene with the mild cynicism of a man who knew that snow meant blocked roads, stranded tourists and elderly residents who would inevitably venture out without proper footwear. His dog Lugs, a mixed breed of uncertain ancestry with a lopsided ear and an expression of perpetual worry, lay sprawled before the wood-burning stove, having claimed the warmest spot in the station, with the territorial certainty of a creature who knew his rights. Grand weather for Christmas, Hamish muttered to himself, watching as fat snowflakes drifted past the window with deceptive gentleness. He had spent the morning clearing the path to the station, and knew from bitter experience that by evening it would need doing again. The telephone rang, startling Lugs into a brief show of alertness before the dog decided the interruption was not worth investigating and settled back into slumber. "Locked up, police," Hamish answered, already dreading what fresh crisis the weather had delivered. "Hamish, it is Agnes Pettigrew." The voice was sharp and precise, belonging to a woman who considered emotions a sign of weak character. "I find myself in an unusual situation." Hamish suppressed a sigh. Mrs. Agnes Pettigrew was a widow of formidable respectability, who lived alone in a cottage at the edge of the village. She was not given to exaggeration, which meant her unusual situation was likely to be genuinely troublesome. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Pettigrew?" "I appear to have acquired a Christmas guest," she said, her tone suggesting this was only marginally less alarming than discovering a wolf in her parlour. "A Mr. Lionel Barrington. His motor car expired on the road to Inverness, and as the garage cannot attend to it until after the holiday, he requires accommodation. Mrs. Calder's bed and breakfast is fully booked naturally, and the man seemed quite respectable, so I have taken him in." "That is kind of you," Hamish said carefully. "It is Christian charity," Agnes corrected him firmly, "though I confess the company is not entirely unwelcome. He is well-spoken and has excellent manners. Quite English, of course, but one cannot hold that against him." Hamish smiled despite himself. "I am sure he will be a model guest. I am telephoning merely to inform you of his presence in case there are inquiries. He mentioned he was visiting friends for Christmas when his car failed him. I thought you should know there is a stranger in the village." "Thank you, Mrs. Pettigrew. Very thoughtful of you." After he rang off, Hamish returned to the window. Agnes Pettigrew was a sensible woman, not given to unnecessary alarm, but there was something in her voice that suggested the situation had disturbed her more than she cared to admit. Loneliness did strange things to people at Christmas, he reflected. The holiday had a way of magnifying solitude until it became almost unbearable. The afternoon wore on with the peculiar silence that snow brings to the Highlands. Hamish made his rounds, checking on the elderly and infirm, ensuring that chimneys were drawing properly and that no one had ventured onto the frozen loch. He stopped at the Italian restaurant, where the proprietor, Willie Lamont, was polishing glasses with religious fervour. "Quiet today, Willie," Hamish observed. "Aye, the snow keeps folk at home," Willie said, his thin face creased with worry. "Bad for business, Hamish. Very bad. It will pass. It always does." At the general store, Mrs. Curry was holding forth to a captive audience about the shocking cost of cranberries. Jessie and Nessie Curry, the village's twin spinsters, flanked her like bookends, nodding in synchronized disapproval. "Hamish," Jessie called out, "have you heard about Agnes Pettigrew's gentleman caller?" "Gentleman caller," echoed Nessie. "He's a stranded motorist," Hamish said mildly. "Nothing more." "Och, but he is ever so handsome," Jessie said, her eyes bright with speculation. "English, mind you, but well turned out. Agnes has not looked so pleased in years." "So pleased in years," Nessie repeated. Hamish escaped before they could elaborate further, and made his way to the Loch Dubh Arms, where the warmth and the smell of beer provided a welcome refuge from both the cold and village gossip. Archie McLean, the fisherman, sat at his usual spot by the fire, nursing a dram. "Hamish," Archie greeted him, "you will be wanting to know about the Englishman." "News travels fast," Hamish said, settling onto a stool. "Aye, well, he was in here last night. Polite enough fellow, though asking a lot of questions. Wanted to know about the old families, who had lived here long ago, that sort of thing. I thought it odd for a man just passing through." "What sort of questions?" Archie shrugged. "About houses that used to stand where they do not anymore. About folk who have died or moved away. I told him he should speak to the minister if he wanted history lessons." "And did he?" "Attended the carol service last night, so he did. Stayed after, talking to Reverend Morrison about parish records." Hamish filed this information away. A stranded motorist showing unusual interest in local history was mildly curious, though perhaps innocent enough. Some people were genuinely fascinated by genealogy and Highland history. Christmas Eve passed peacefully. The snow continued to fall soft and relentless, transforming Loch Dubh into a scene of postcard perfection. Hamish attended the midnight service at the kirk, where candlelight flickered on stone walls and voices rose in ancient hymns. He saw Agnes Pettigrew in her usual pew, and beside her a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and an air of quiet authority. Lionel Barrington, presumably. The man caught Hamish's eye and nodded politely, a stranger acknowledging the local constable with proper respect. There was nothing in his manner to suggest anything amiss, yet Hamish felt the faintest prickle of unease, that copper's instinct that had served him well over the years. After the service, Hamish walked home through streets muffled by snow, lugs trotting at his heels. The village was silent except for the soft crunch of boots and paws on fresh powder. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and with any luck it would be peaceful. He was wrong about that, as it turned out. The telephone woke him at 8 o'clock on Christmas morning. It was Agnes Pettigrew, and this time there was no mistaking the alarm in her voice. "Hamish, you must come at once. Mr. Barrington has vanished." Hamish was instantly alert. Vanished? He did not appear for breakfast. I thought perhaps he had overslept, but when I knocked on his door there was no answer. I took the liberty of entering the room. The bed is made, his suitcase is gone, and there is no sign of him whatsoever. "Have you checked outside? Perhaps he went for a walk. His boots are missing, but his coat remains on the hook. Hamish, it is below freezing. No one would venture out in this weather without a coat." "I will be there directly," Hamish said. He dressed quickly, pulling on his uniform and heavy jacket. Lugs regarded him with reproachful eyes, having hoped for a lazy Christmas morning by the fire. "Come on then," Hamish said. "Duty calls." As he stepped out into the brittle cold of Christmas morning, Hamish could not shake the feeling that Agnes Pettigrew's unusual Christmas guest had brought more than just company to Loch Dubh. He had brought a mystery, and mysteries in the Highlands were rarely as innocent as they first appeared. Chapter 2. Vanished without a trace. Agnes Pettigrew's cottage stood at the northern edge of Loch Dubh, a neat stone building with a slate roof and windows that looked out over the loch. Hamish could see it clearly as he trudged through the snow, lugs bounding ahead with the enthusiasm of a dog who considered any outing preferable to staying indoors. Agnes met him at the door, her usual composure slightly frayed. She was a tall, spare woman in her 60s, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a bun, and the ramrod posture of someone who had spent their youth being told to sit up straight. "Thank you for coming so promptly, Hamish," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I did not wish to cause alarm, but the circumstances are most peculiar." The cottage was precisely what Hamish had expected, spotlessly clean, modestly furnished, and smelling faintly of furniture polish and the pine garland that decorated the mantelpiece. Everything in its place, nothing frivolous or unnecessary. It was the home of a woman who had made peace with solitude by imposing rigid order upon her surroundings. "Show me his room," Hamish said. The guest bedroom was on the ground floor, a small chamber with a single bed, a wardrobe, and a window overlooking the garden. The bed was indeed made, the coverlet smooth and unwrinkled. There was no suitcase, no personal effects, nothing to indicate anyone had slept there. "You are certain he used this room?" Hamish asked. Agnes gave him a look that could have frozen the lock solid. "Of course I am certain. His case was there by the wardrobe when I brought him tea yesterday evening. He thanked me most courteously and said he would retire early." Hamish examined the room methodically. The wardrobe was empty save for spare blankets. The small table beside the bed held nothing but a Bible and a lamp. He knelt to look under the bed and found only dust-free floorboards. "His coat is still here, you said?" Agnes led him to the hallway where a heavy wool overcoat hung on a peg. A gentleman's coat of good quality, dark grey with a velvet collar. Beside it, a hook stood empty. "That is where his boots were," Agnes said. Walking boots, well worn but properly maintained. Hamish felt the coat pockets and found them empty. He checked the label. Burberry, London, an expensive garment, not the sort of thing that a man would willingly abandon. "What did he take with him for dinner last night?" Hamish asked. "Dinner was at 7. Roast chicken, vegetables, and a trifle for afters. He ate well and complimented my cooking. He seemed perfectly content." "And after dinner?" "We sat by the fire for a time. He was good company, I must admit. We discussed books, the weather, his supposed friends in Inverness. He retired to his room at 9 o'clock, saying he wished to write some letters." "Did you hear anything during the night?" Agnes hesitated. "I am not certain. I thought I heard the front door, perhaps around 11, but I was half asleep and could not swear to it. This morning I found the door unlocked, which is unusual. I always lock it before bed." Hamish went to examine the front door. The lock was intact, showing no signs of tampering. If Lionel Barrington had left by this door, he had either had a key or Agnes had indeed left it unlocked. Could he have taken a key? "There is only the one, which I keep on my person," Agnes said, patting her cardigan pocket. "Unless he found the spare in the kitchen drawer, but I cannot think why he would go looking for it." They returned to the kitchen, where Agnes insisted on making tea despite Hamish's protests that he did not wish to impose on Christmas morning. The spare key was indeed missing from its drawer. "So he planned his departure," Hamish mused, accepting the cup of tea. "Took his belongings, found the spare key, and left in the middle of the night. The question is why?" "Perhaps he received word that his friends could accommodate him after all," Agnes suggested, though her tone suggested she did not believe it. "Without his coat? In this weather?" "It does seem improbable." Hamish went outside to examine the snow. The garden path had been cleared yesterday, but fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering any tracks that might have been left. He walked the perimeter of the cottage, Lug sniffing enthusiastically at every drift and tuft of frozen grass. Behind the cottage, where the garden met the open ground leading down to the loch, Hamish found something that made him pause. The snow here was disturbed, as if someone had walked through it, but the prints were already filling in, made indistinct by the continuing snowfall. They seemed to lead toward the water's edge. He followed them as far as he could, but they disappeared into the virgin snow. Either the tracks had been completely covered, or whoever made them had turned back at some point. "Most odd," Hamish muttered. Lugs barked, a sharp sound in the white stillness, and bounded towards something at the edge of the frozen reeds. Hamish hurried after him and found his dog nosing at a patch of disturbed snow near the waterline. There was nothing obviously significant about the spot, but Hamish's instincts prickled. The snow here had been compacted, then covered over. Someone had stood here, perhaps for some time. He was making his way back to the cottage when he encountered Mrs. Ruth Calder coming up the path. She was a handsome woman in her early 50s, with kind eyes and the capable manner of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. She ran Loch Dub's only bed and breakfast and was universally regarded as helpful and efficient. "Hamish," she called out. Agnes telephoned me about her missing guest. I came as soon as I heard. How dreadful for her, especially on Christmas Day." "Aye, it is a puzzle," Hamish agreed. "The poor dear must be beside herself. Is there anything I can do to help?" "Did you meet Mr. Barrington while he was in the village?" Ruth shook her head. "I saw him at the carol service, but we were not introduced. Such a distinguished-looking gentleman. Agnes seemed quite pleased to have company for Christmas." "You didn't have room for him at your establishment?" "I was fully booked, I'm afraid. The holidays, you know. Otherwise I would have been happy to accommodate him." She paused, her brow furrowing. "You do not think anything untoward has happened, do you?" "Too early to say," Hamish replied carefully. "But if you hear anything, or if anyone mentions seeing him, please let me know." "Of course. In the meantime I shall sit with Agnes. She should not be alone at a time like this." Hamish watched her continue up the path, noting the easy confidence of her stride. Ruth Calder had moved to Lochdup 5 years ago, opening her bed and breakfast and quickly becoming part of the village fabric. She was the sort of woman who joined committees, organised bake sales, and remembered everyone's birthdays. Exactly the sort of person who would drop everything to comfort a distressed neighbour on Christmas morning. He was about to follow when Archie McLean appeared, walking along the road with the rolling gait of a man more accustomed to boat decks than solid ground. "Hamish, I heard there was trouble at Agnes's place." Word travelled faster than influenza in Lochdup. "Her guest has gone missing," Hamish confirmed. The Englishman. "Och, I may have something for you." Archie reached into his jacket and produced a man's hat, soggy and bedraggled. "Found this in the river this morning. Caught in the reeds near the old bridge. Thought it might be important." Hamish took the hat carefully. It was a good quality fedora, dark grey, the same colour as the abandoned coat. The band inside bore the initials LB. "Where exactly did you find it?" "About half a mile downstream from here. The current must have carried it." "Hamish, you do not think—" "I think we need to search the riverbank," Hamish said grimly, "and we may need Dr. Dalrymple." By early afternoon the search had expanded to include several villagers, all of whom had abandoned their Christmas dinners to help. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the landscape pristine and treacherous. They worked their way along both banks of the river, probing drifts and peering into the dark water where ice had not yet formed. It was de Dalrymple himself who made the next discovery. The elderly physician, called from his fireside with poor grace, found a wallet lodged against a rock in a shallow pool. The leather was waterlogged but intact, and inside were credit cards and a driving licence, all bearing the name Lionel Barrington. "This does not look promising," the doctor said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "A man's hat and wallet in the river? His coat left behind? It suggests he may have drowned." "Without a body we cannot be certain," Hamish said, though his heart had sunk. The evidence was beginning to point in a direction he had hoped to avoid. "Perhaps he fell in the dark," Ruth Calder suggested. She had indeed stayed with Agnes and had insisted on joining the search. The banks are treacherous when frozen. "Perhaps," Hamish agreed, though something about the scenario troubled him. A man leaves his coat but takes his boots. He walks to the river in the middle of a winter night. His hat and wallet end up in the water, but his body does not. Nothing about Lionel Barrington's disappearance made sense, and Hamish had learned long ago that when things did not make sense, it was usually because someone was working very hard to create confusion. As darkness fell on Christmas Day and the searchers returned to their homes, Hamish stood alone by the river, watching the water slide past, black and cold and keeping its secrets. Lugs pressed against his leg, shivering despite his shaggy coat. "Come on, boy," Hamish said quietly. "We have work to do." Because whether Lionel Barrington had drowned, run away, or met with foul play, one thing was becoming clear. The charming English stranger had brought more than inconvenience to Lochdup. He had brought a mystery that would not rest until the truth was uncovered, and Hamish Macbeth had never been one to leave mysteries unsolved. Chapter 3. A Guest with a Past. Boxing Day dawned clear and cold, the sky a hard blue that promised no mercy from the frost. Hamish sat at his desk in the police station, a mug of strong tea at his elbow, and Lionel Barrington's waterlogged wallet spread before him on a towel. The contents had dried overnight. 3 credit cards, a driving licence, £70 in soggy notes, a London Underground ticket, and a photograph of a woman who might have been 40 or 60, her features rendered ageless by the camera's flattering lens. Hamish had telephoned the number on the back of one credit card at first light, only to be informed by a recorded message that the account had been closed 3 months previously. The driving licence gave an address in Kensington, which might or might not be genuine. "We shall see," Hamish told Luggs, who had taken up residence on the old sofa and was watching his master with the patient resignation of a dog who knew breakfast was being delayed by human preoccupations. The police computer was temperamental at the best of times, and this morning it seemed particularly reluctant to cooperate. After 10 minutes of coaxing, Hamish managed to access the national database and entered Lionel Barrington's details. What came back made him sit up straighter in his chair. The passport number from the driving licence belonged to one Lionel Charles Barrington, deceased. Death certificate issued 14 months ago following a heart attack in Spain. No suspicious circumstances. Hamish stared at the screen, his mind working through the implications. Either Lionel Barrington had achieved a miraculous resurrection, or the man who had stayed with Agnes Pettigrew had been using a dead man's identity. He printed the information and reached for the telephone. Detective Chief Inspector Blair, his superior in Strathbane, would need to be informed, much as Hamish dreaded the prospect. Blair was a lazy, bullying drunk who took credit for Hamish's successes and blamed him for any failures. The thought of Blair descending on Loch Dubh with his usual bluster and incompetence was enough to sour the morning. Before he could dial, however, there was a knock at the door. Jessie Curry stood on the threshold, her twin Nessie hovering behind her like an echo. "Hamish," Jessie began breathlessly, "we thought you should know that Mr. Barrington, he was asking the strangest questions." "Strangest questions," Nessie confirmed. Hamish gestured them inside, grateful for the interruption. Luggs lifted his head hopefully, recognised the visitors as unlikely to provide food, and returned to his slumber. "What sort of questions?" Hamish asked, fetching 2 chairs. The twins settled themselves with the air of women preparing to deliver important intelligence. Jessie leaned forward conspiratorially. "He came into the shop 2 days ago on Christmas Eve morning before the snow got bad. Asked about old houses in the village, he did. Wanted to know which families had lived here longest." "Lived here longest," Nessie echoed. "He was particularly interested in the McLaren house, the one that burned down 10 years back. Asked who had owned it, where they had gone." Hamish's interest sharpened. The McLaren house had been a substantial property on the outskirts of the village, reduced to rubble after an electrical fire. The family had moved to Glasgow and never returned. "What did you tell him?" "Just what everyone knows," Jessie said. "That old Donald McLaren lived there with his sister until she passed, and then the fire happened, and Donald went to stay with his daughter in the city. Nothing mysterious about it." "Nothing mysterious," Nessie agreed. "Did he ask about anyone else?" Jessie's eyes brightened. "Aye, he asked about former residents, people who used to live here but moved away. He seemed very interested in a woman called— oh, what was her name, Nessie?" "Evelyn something," Nessie supplied. "Or was it Ellen?" "Evelyn, I think. Anyway, we told him we could not recall anyone by that name, and he seemed disappointed." After the twins left, Hamish sat in thought. A man using a dead person's identity, asking questions about old residents and houses, showing particular interest in people who had left the village. The pattern suggested someone searching for something or someone, but what or who remained unclear. He decided to speak with Archie McLean again and found the fisherman mending nets in his small cottage by the harbour. "Archie," Hamish said, accepting a dram of whisky despite the early hour, "you mentioned Mr. Barrington asked about parish records." "Aye, he did. Went to the kirk after the carol service and cornered Reverend Morrison. I was still there, helping to put away the hymn books, so I heard some of it." "What was he after?" Archie's weathered face creased in concentration. "Records of births and deaths, marriages, that sort of thing. said he was researching his family tree. The Reverend told him the old records were kept in the vestry, and he was welcome to look at them after Christmas, but Mr. Barrington seemed keen to see them straight away. Quite insistent he was, though polite enough about it. And did the Reverend allow it? Oh, no. Reverend Morrison is a stickler for proper procedures. Told him to come back after the holiday, when the church secretary would be available to supervise. Mr. Barrington thanked him nicely enough, but I could tell he was frustrated. Hamish finished his whisky and made his way to the manse, where Reverend Morrison greeted him with weary courtesy. The minister was a thin, ascetic man in his 60s, dedicated to his flock but not blind to their weaknesses. Hamish, I expected you might call. Most distressing business about Mrs. Pettigrew's guest. I understand he was interested in the parish records. Indeed. Genealogy, he claimed, though I confess I found his urgency somewhat peculiar. Family history is important, certainly, but it can surely wait until after Christmas. Did he mention which family he was researching? The Reverend frowned. He was rather vague on that point. Said he was looking for connections to the Highlands, ancestors who might have lived in this area. I suggested he contact the General Register Office in Edinburgh for more comprehensive records, but he seemed determined to examine our local documents. Might I have a look at those records myself? Of course, though I cannot imagine what you hope to find. The vestry was cold and musty, lined with shelves holding ledgers that dated back 2 centuries. Hamish spent an hour paging through birth and death records, marriage certificates and burial registers, searching for he knew not what. It was Reverend Morrison who noticed it first. Hamish, look at this entry from 20 years ago. A death certificate for a woman named Evelyn Boyd. The name rings a bell, does it not? Hamish peered at the spidery handwriting. Evelyn Margaret Boyd, aged 34, deceased March 15th, 20 years past. Cause of death, accidental drowning in Loch Duv, body recovered, burial in the kirkyard. Boyd, Hamish said slowly, not Barrington. Quite so, though if one were looking for connections, Boyd and Barrington are not so very different. Same initials, for instance. Hamish felt pieces of the puzzle shifting in his mind, not yet forming a complete picture, but suggesting the outline of one. He thanked the Reverend and walked to the kirkyard, lugs trailing behind with the resigned air of a dog whose morning walk had turned into something far more tedious. The grave was easy to find, marked by a simple granite stone. Evelyn Margaret Boyd, beloved sister, at peace. The dates matched those in the parish register. Hamish stood before it, the winter wind cutting through his jacket. A woman had drowned in the loch 20 years ago. Now a man using false identity had come to Loch asking questions about old residents, examining parish records, and had himself apparently drowned in circumstances that seemed increasingly suspicious. The coincidence was too great to ignore. Back at the police station, Hamish telephoned contacts in Aberdeen and Edinburgh, calling in favours and requesting information. By late afternoon he had assembled a disturbing picture. Lionel Barrington, the real Lionel Barrington, had been a successful antiquarian book dealer who died of natural causes in Malaga. But before his death he had reported his passport stolen during a visit to London. Someone had taken that passport and assumed Barrington's identity. Someone who had come to Loch Duba with purpose, asking questions, searching records, looking for something connected to a woman who had drowned 2 decades earlier. The question that troubled Hamish most was not who the false Barrington had been, but why someone would go to such elaborate lengths to investigate an old drowning, and whether that someone had met the same fate as the woman they were researching. As darkness fell and Lugs demanded his long-delayed dinner, Hamish made notes in his careful hand listing what he knew and what he suspected. The lists were disturbingly uneven, heavy on suspicion and light on fact. But one thing was becoming clear. Lionel Barrington, whoever he truly was, had come to Loch Duba seeking answers about the past. And that past, Hamish suspected, was about to reach forward and claim more victims before this mystery was resolved. Chapter 4, The First Red Herrings. The morning brought Detective Chief Inspector Blair to Loch, and with him the particular brand of chaos that followed the man like a bad smell. He arrived in a police car driven by Detective Jimmy Anderson, who gave Hamish an apologetic shrug as Blair heaved himself out of the passenger seat. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his florid face already showing signs of the previous night's drinking. "What is this nonsense about a missing Englishman? Probably just buggered off without paying his bill." "He was a guest of Mrs. Pettigrew," Hamish said mildly. "There was no bill." "Then what are you wasting police time for? Man's entitled to leave when he pleases. He left his coat behind in freezing weather, sir, and his hat and wallet were found in the river." This gave Blair pause, though he rallied quickly. "Suicide, then. Or accident. Open and shut. Get a statement from the old biddy and we'll close the case." "The old biddy's name is Mrs. Pettigrew," Hamish said, "and the man was using a false identity. The real Lionel Barrington has been dead for over a year." Blair's face went through several interesting colour changes. "False identity? Why did you not say so immediately? This could be serious." Jimmy Anderson caught Hamish's eye and winked. They both knew Blair's definition of serious, anything that might reflect well on him if solved, or badly if bungled. "I shall interview all potential witnesses," Blair announced. "Anderson, fetch your notebook. Macbeth, you will assist." What followed was a masterclass in how not to conduct an investigation. Blair bullied, blustered, and generally antagonised everyone he spoke to, while Hamish trailed behind attempting damage control. Agnes Pettigrew bore Blair's interrogation with icy dignity, answering his questions precisely and offering no more information than requested. When Blair suggested she might have been foolish to take in a stranger, her expression could have flash-frozen a salmon. "I acted from Christian charity, Chief Inspector, a concept with which you may be unfamiliar. The man presented as a gentleman in distress. I saw no reason to doubt him." "Aye, well, charity begins at home," Blair muttered, making a note that probably read something insulting. It was during the interviews that the first serious suspects began to emerge, though not in ways that satisfied Hamish's growing unease about the case. Angus McNab, the reclusive fisherman who lived in a tumble-down cottage near the old pier, had apparently argued with Barrington at the pub on Christmas Eve. Willie Lamont, who had been polishing glasses at the time, confirmed the altercation. "Voices were raised," Willie said, wringing his hands nervously under Blair's glare. "Mr. Barrington accused Angus of lying about something. I could not hear all of it, but Angus was fair furious." They found Angus hauling krills on the beach, his grizzled face set in its usual expression of general disapproval of humanity. I argued with the man," Angus admitted when confronted. "He was asking questions about a boating accident from years back, suggesting I had not been truthful about it. I told him to mind his own business." "What accident?" Blair demanded. "My brother drowned 15 years ago," Angus said flatly. "Boat capsized in a storm. I was aboard and survived. The investigation cleared me of any wrongdoing, but this Barrington fellow, or whatever his name was, implied I had something to hide." "And do you?" Blair leaned forward aggressively. "No." The single word was delivered with such finality that even Blair hesitated. "Where were you on Christmas Eve night?" Hamish asked quietly. "At sea, night fishing, got back dawn on Christmas Day. You can check with the harbour master. Logged my departure and return." The alibi proved solid. Angus had indeed been out all night, his boat tracked on radar, his catch logged and sold the following morning. The next suspect was closer to home. Morag Sinclair, Agnes Pettigrew's nearest neighbour, had reported seeing Barrington walking toward the river late on Christmas Eve. She lived in a cottage 50 yards from Agnes's, a nervous woman in her 40s who had moved to Loch after a messy divorce in Glasgow. Blair's interrogation reduced her to tears within minutes. "I only mentioned it because I thought it might be helpful," she sobbed. "I was closing my curtains around 11 o'clock and saw someone walking past, heading toward the water. It looked like Mr. Barrington from his build and the way he moved." "You're certain it was him?" Hamish asked gently. earning a glare from Blair for his solicitude. Well, no, not absolutely certain. It was dark and snowing. But who else would be out at that hour? What was he wearing? Morag's face crumpled further. I cannot remember clearly. Dark clothing, I think. I only glimpsed him for a moment. After she had been dismissed, still sniffling, Hamish examined the meteorological records. The heavy snow had begun at 10:30 on Christmas Eve and continued until 3 in the morning. If Morag had seen someone at 11, any tracks would have been covered within the hour. The woman's testimony is worthless, Hamish told Blair. The timing does not match the snowfall pattern. Nonsense, Blair declared. She saw the victim walking to his death, clear as day. But privately, Blair seemed less certain. The case was developing complications, and complications made Blair nervous. Worse, they required actual work. The third suspect emerged almost by accident. Ruth Calder, while serving tea to the investigating officers at her bed and breakfast, mentioned that Agnes had seemed unusually interested in Barrington's finances. She asked him about his circumstances, Ruth said, pouring tea with a practised ease. I happened to overhear when I visited on Christmas Eve. Something about insurance and investments. I thought it a touch indelicate, but Agnes is a practical woman. Blair seized on this with the enthusiasm of a man finding an easy solution. The old woman stands to gain from his death. Life insurance fraud. That is ridiculous, Hamish protested. They had only just met. Maybe that is what she wants us to think. Maybe they knew each other before. Maybe she lured him here deliberately. When confronted, Agnes admitted the conversation, but with characteristic forthrightness. Mr. Barrington mentioned he had recently purchased a substantial life insurance policy, she said. He was advising me to do the same, as a prudent financial arrangement. I told him I had no need of such things at my age. That was the extent of it. Who was named as beneficiary on this policy? Blair demanded. I have no idea. We did not discuss details. It was merely conversation over dinner. Blair remained convinced he had found his killer, but the theory collapsed when Ruth Calder herself provided Agnes with an alibi. She had telephoned Agnes at 11:30 on Christmas Eve to wish her happy Christmas and had spoken to her for 20 minutes. Agnes was at home, in her parlour, Ruth confirmed. I could hear the wireless in the background playing carols. We discussed the church service and made plans to share Boxing Day dinner. 3 suspects, 3 alibis. Hamish felt the familiar frustration of a case that seemed to be deliberately obscuring itself. Every lead dissolved upon examination, every witness proved unreliable or mistaken. Blair, faced with actual investigative work and no easy arrests, announced he was returning to Strathbane to coordinate the search from headquarters, which everyone understood to mean he was going to the pub. Keep me informed of developments, Macbeth, he ordered, and try not to make a mess of things. After the police car had departed in a spray of slush, Jimmy Anderson lingered behind. What do you really think, Hamish? He asked quietly. I think someone is being very clever, Hamish replied. 3 suspects, all with apparent motives, all neatly eliminated. It feels like misdirection. You think someone is deliberately pointing us away from the truth? I think we are meant to exhaust ourselves chasing shadows while the real killer watches and waits. Jimmy nodded slowly. The helpful witness who provides alibis. The convenient sightings that lead nowhere. The arguments that seem significant but prove irrelevant. Exactly. Someone wants us confused. Any idea who? Hamish looked out over the loch, grey and cold under the winter sky. Not yet, but whoever it is, they have been very patient and very thorough. This was not a crime of passion, Jimmy. This was planned. After Jimmy left, Hamish sat in the police station with lugs at his feet, reviewing his notes. Somewhere in the tangle of false leads and convenient alibis was the truth, if he could only see it clearly. The problem was that everyone in Lockdub seemed to have had some contact with Barrington, everyone had something to hide, and everyone had been exactly where they claimed to be when he disappeared, which meant either the entire village was lying in concert, or the real suspect was someone he had not yet properly considered. Someone who was being very helpful indeed. Chapter 5, Motives in the Snow. The day after Blair's disruptive visit, Hamish received a telephone call from a contact in London, detective sergeant named Palmer, who owed him a favour from a case 3 years past involving stolen paintings and a suspiciously well-travelled Edinburgh art dealer. Your Lionel Barrington, Palmer said without preamble, was actually Leonard Boyd. Bit of a nasty piece of work from what I can gather. Hamish felt the pieces shift again in his mind. Boyd. The same surname as Evelyn Boyd, the woman who had drowned in Loch Dubh 20 years ago. "Tell me everything," he said. Leonard Boyd was a financial investigator, specialising in tracking hidden assets for divorce cases and fraud investigations. Very good at his job, apparently, but not particularly scrupulous about how he obtained information. There were allegations of blackmail, though nothing ever stuck. He disappeared from London about 18 months ago, shortly after a rather messy case involving a merchant banker and his mistress. What happened to him? No one knows. He vanished, taking considerable evidence with him. Several people had reason to want him gone, but there was never any suggestion of foul play. Most assumed he had simply decided to retire early with whatever leverage he had acquired. "What can you tell me about his family?" Palmer paused, and Hamish heard papers rustling. He was married briefly in his 20s to a woman named Evelyn, divorced acrimoniously. She died some years later, I believe, though I would need to check the details. "She drowned," Hamish said quietly, "in Loch Dubh 20 years ago." "Bloody hell, that is your connection, then." After he rang off, Hamish sat staring at his notes. Leonard Boyd had come to Loch Dubh using a false identity, asking questions about his ex-wife's death, examining parish records. The question was whether he had been seeking closure or something else entirely. He decided to speak with Agnes Pettigrew again and found her in her garden, clearing snow from the path with determined strokes of a shovel. "Mrs. Pettigrew," Hamish began, "I need to ask you about the conversations you had with Mr. Barrington." Agnes leaned on her shovel. "I have told you everything, Hamish." "You mentioned he asked about your late husband's finances." "That is correct. He asked whether my husband had left any outstanding debts or unusual investments. I told him Donald's affairs were perfectly in order. Why would he ask such a thing?" "What else did he discuss?" Agnes frowned, thinking back. "He asked about the history of the cottage, how long I had lived here, whether I knew the previous owners. He seemed particularly interested in properties that had changed hands in the past 20 years. Did he mention anyone by name? No, but he asked whether I knew of anyone who had left Loch Dubh suddenly, or under unusual circumstances. I told him people come and go in the Highlands as they please. We are not a village of gossips, despite what the Curry sisters might suggest." Hamish thanked her and walked to the churchyard, where he stood again before Evelyn Boyd's grave. The stone gave no indication of her relationship to anyone, listing her only as a beloved sister. He made a note to check who had paid for the burial. Morag Sinclair proved more forthcoming when Hamish called on her that afternoon. She had recovered from Blair's interrogation and was eager to be helpful, though her information was more intriguing than she perhaps realised. "Mr. Edward Barrington came to my door on Christmas Eve afternoon," she said, serving Hamish tea in her neat sitting room. "He apologised for the intrusion and asked whether I had lived in Loch Dubh long enough to remember a woman named Evelyn who had died here years ago." "What did you tell him?" "That I only moved here 7 years ago and knew nothing of the village's history before my arrival." He seemed disappointed, but thanked me politely. She hesitated. "There was something else, though. He asked whether I knew of anyone in the village who had lived here 20 years ago and might remember the incident." "And do you?" "I suggested he speak with Archie MacLean, or perhaps the minister. Both have been here for decades." Hamish found Archie at the harbour as usual, working on his boat with the methodical patience of a man who had nothing but time. "Aye. He asked me about that drowning," Archie confirmed. "I remember it well enough. Sad business. The woman was staying at a cottage she had rented for the summer, doing some sort of research or writing, I believe. She went out in a small boat one evening and never came back. They found her body 3 days later, caught in the reeds downstream. Was there an investigation? There was. The police came from Strathbane, asked questions, examined the boat. It had capsized, likely hit a rock in the current. The woman was not a strong swimmer, and the water was cold even in summer. The verdict was accidental death. Who identified the body? Archie's weathered face creased in thought. Her sister, I believe, came up from Aberdeen to claim her. I remember thinking it was odd that the sister was the only family member mentioned. No husband, no children, just the sister. Do you remember the sister's name? No, sorry. It was 20 years ago, Hamish. I barely remember what I had for breakfast this morning. But Hamish's instincts were humming now. He returned to the police station and placed another call to Palmer in London. I need you to find out everything you can about Evelyn Boyd's family, particularly any surviving relatives. Palmer called back 2 hours later. Evelyn Boyd had one sister, 5 years younger, name of Ruth Boyd, though she apparently changed it to Ruth Calder after her sister's death. No marriage, so the name change must have been by deed poll. Hamish felt his pulse quicken. Ruth Calder, the helpful bed and breakfast owner who had moved to Loch Dubh 5 years ago, who seemed to know everyone's business, who had provided convenient alibis and steered the investigation with subtle suggestions. Where was Ruth Calder living before she moved to Loch Dubh? He asked, though he already suspected the answer. Aberdeen. Worked as a hotel manager before she bought the B&B in your village. Hamish, what is this about? I think, Hamish said slowly, it is about unfinished business. He thanked Palmer and sat back, assembling the narrative. Leonard Boyd had destroyed his wife's life somehow, possibly during their divorce. She had fled to Loch Dubh to escape him, and had died here in circumstances ruled accidental. Her sister Ruth had identified the body and had spent the next 15 years building a new life, eventually moving to the very place where her sister had drowned. Then Leonard Boyd had reappeared, using a false name, asking questions about the past. Had he been seeking some sort of resolution? Or had he been up to his old tricks, looking for leverage, or hidden assets? And what had Ruth Calder done when she recognised her former brother-in-law? The question now was how to prove any of it. Ruth had been carefully helpful throughout the investigation, providing information and alibis that appeared above suspicion. She had been at her bed and breakfast on Christmas Eve, with guests who could vouch for her presence. Unless those guests were mistaken about the timing, or unless Ruth had convinced someone else to make the telephone call to Agnes that provided her alibi. Hamish needed to speak with Ruth's Christmas guests, and he needed to do so without alerting her to his suspicions. The guests, it turned out, had been a retired couple from Edinburgh, Mr. Disappearance and Mrs. Graham, who had stayed 2 nights over Christmas before departing on Boxing Day. Hamish tracked them down through their home number and spoke with Mrs. Graham. "Oh yes, Mrs. Calder was a wonderful hostess," she said warmly. "So attentive. She made us feel quite at home." "Do you recall her whereabouts on Christmas Eve evening?" "Well, she served us dinner at 7, and then excused herself, saying she had some errands to attend to. We sat in the lounge afterward, watched some television. I believe she returned around 9 or so." "You're certain about the time?" "Reasonably certain. The news was just ending when she came back." 2 hours unaccounted for. Long enough to walk to Agnes's cottage, long enough for something to happen to Leonard Boyd. But it was not proof. Hamish needed more than suspicious timing and a changed name. He needed to understand exactly what had happened on Christmas Eve, and why Leonard Boyd's hat and wallet had ended up in the river while his body remained missing. As evening fell and the temperature dropped toward frost, Hamish walked the route from Ruth Calder's bed and breakfast to Agnes Pettigrew's cottage. It was perhaps a 15-minute walk easily accomplished in the dark, and the fresh snow that night would have covered any tracks. He stood outside Agnes's cottage, looking toward the river, and realised something that had been nagging at him since the beginning. If Leonard Boyd had drowned in the river, his body should have been found by now. The current was not strong enough to carry it far, and the water was shallow in most places. Yet despite searches, nothing had been recovered except a hat and wallet that could easily have been placed there deliberately. which meant either Boyd was still alive and had staged his own disappearance, or he was dead and hidden somewhere other than the river. And if he was dead and hidden, then someone had to know where. Someone who was being very patient, very careful, and very, very clever. Chapter 6. False Trails Deepen. The following morning brought a thaw, the temperature rising just enough to turn the pristine snow into grey slush that made walking treacherous and driving worse. Hamish navigated the slippery streets of Loch Dubh, with Lugs picking his way delicately beside him, the dog's expression suggesting that winter in the Highlands was a personal affront. Hamish had spent half the night reviewing everything he knew about the case, and the other half wondering if he was seeing conspiracies where none existed. Ruth Calder had lived peacefully in Loch Dubh for 5 years. She was respected, well-liked, helpful to a fault. Could he really believe her capable of murder based solely on a changed name and 2 missing hours? The problem was that the evidence against the other suspects had dissolved like the melting snow. He decided to confirm this properly, starting with Agnes Pettigrew. He found her at Ruth Calder's bed and breakfast, the 2 women sharing morning tea in the parlour. Ruth welcomed him with her usual warmth. "Hamish, how lovely. You will join us, of course." "Just briefly," he said, accepting a cup. "Mrs. Pettigrew, I need to clarify something about your conversation with Mr. Barrington regarding insurance." Agnes set down her teacup with precision. "I have told you everything about that conversation. I understand he was advising you to purchase life insurance. Did he suggest any particular company or policy?" "No, it was merely general advice, the sort of thing one hears from financially minded people. He seemed to think everyone should have such arrangements in place." "Did he mention having taken out a policy himself?" "He said he had recently done so, yes. He called it prudent planning for the future." Agnes's expression softened slightly. Looking back, perhaps he had a premonition of his fate. "Or perhaps he was planning something," Ruth said quietly. "Forgive me for saying so, Agnes, but the man was using a false identity. Who knows what his true intentions were?" It was neatly done, Hamish thought. Ruth subtly casting doubt on Leonard Boyd's character while appearing sympathetic. "Mrs. Calder," Hamish said, "you mentioned you telephoned Mrs. Pettigrew on Christmas Eve at 11:30. "That is correct." "And you spoke for 20 minutes? "About that, yes. We discussed the carol service and made arrangements for Boxing Day dinner. Why do you ask?" "Just confirming details," Hamish said mildly. "Where were you calling from?" Ruth's expression did not change. "From my own parlour. The Grahams had retired for the night, and I was tidying up before bed myself." "The Grahams mentioned you went out that evening." "I did briefly, around 7:30. I needed to drop off some baking at the Kirk for the next day's lunch. I was back by 9. After that, I did not leave the house until the following morning." The alibi held. Unless Mrs. Graham was mistaken about the time Ruth had returned, there was no opportunity for her to have confronted Leonard Boyd at Agnes's cottage. Hamish moved on to verify Morag Sinclair's story. He walked to her cottage and found her gardening despite the slush, determinedly pruning roses that looked unlikely to survive the winter regardless of her efforts. "Mrs. Sinclair, about the person you saw walking toward the river on Christmas Eve." Morag straightened, rubbing her lower back. "I have been thinking about that, Hamish. I may have been mistaken about the time." "Oh?" "I thought it was of 11 o'clock, but I realised later that I had not actually checked my clock. It might have been earlier, perhaps 10 or even 9:30, and as you pointed out, the snow was falling heavily. I cannot even be certain it was a man I saw. It could have been anyone." Another witness recanting, another piece of evidence crumbling. Hamish was not surprised. Morag was the nervous sort, easily convinced she had been wrong about something she was never certain of in the first place. "Thank you for your honesty," he said. His final stop was Angus McNab, who was mending nets in his cottage with the radio playing bagpipe music at a volume that suggested gradual hearing loss. "Angus," Hamish shouted over the din, "about your argument with Barrington." Angus turned down the radio fractionally. "What about it? He accused you of lying about a boating accident. What exactly did he say? He said my brother's death was not as straightforward as the official verdict suggested. He implied I had been negligent, maybe even responsible. I told him he was talking nonsense and to keep his accusations to himself. Did he elaborate on why he thought this? No, and I did not give him the chance. I left the pub before I did something I would regret. Your alibi for Christmas Eve has been verified, Hamish said. The harbour master confirms you were at sea. I know. That detective from Strathbane checked it 3 times, as if he hoped it would change. Angus gave a bitter laugh. I may be many things, Hamish, but I am not a liar. My brother drowned in an accident, and I have lived with that guilt for 15 years without needing some English snoop to remind me of it. Guilt? I should have checked the weather forecast more carefully. I should have insisted we wait another day, but I did not, and Donald paid the price. That is my burden to carry, not a crime to be investigated. After leaving Angus, Hamish stood on the harbour wall, watching the grey water lap against the pilings. Every suspect had been cleared, every motive explained or disproven. The investigation was going backward instead of forward, unless that was exactly what someone wanted. He returned to the police station to find a message from Jimmy Anderson. Blair had lost interest in the case, declaring it an obvious suicide that would be confirmed when the body eventually surfaced. He was closing the investigation pending recovery of remains. Hamish telephoned Jimmy immediately. He cannot close it yet. There are still questions unanswered. I know that and you know that, but try convincing Blair. He says we have wasted enough resources on a man who clearly threw himself in the river and whose body will turn up when the ice melts. He wants you to file a preliminary report and move on. The man was using a false identity, Jimmy. He was here for a specific reason. Blair does not care about reasons. He cares about closing cases with minimum effort. Jimmy lowered his voice. Between you and me, I think you are right to be suspicious. But unless you can produce a body or a confession, Blair will not reopen this. After he rang off, Hamish sat at his desk, thinking. He needed proof, but proof required knowing where Leonard Boyd actually was. The river had yielded nothing but planted evidence. The searchers had found no trace of him. Where did you hide a body in a small Highland village in winter? The question nagged at him as he made his evening rounds, checking on the elderly and ensuring pipes had not frozen in the thaw. It was during these rounds that he passed the old ice house near the edge of the village, a stone structure built into a hillside that had once stored ice cut from the loch in winter for use in summer. No one had used it in decades. The door was always locked, the interior cold and dark and largely forgotten. Hamish stopped, staring at the building. The door was indeed locked, a heavy padlock rusted but intact. Fresh snow had melted around it, but there were no obvious tracks, nothing to suggest anyone had been near it recently. Still, the nagging feeling would not leave him. He returned to the police station for bolt cutters, then came back to the ice house as dusk was falling. Lugs whined uncertainly as Hamish cut through the padlock. The door swung open with a groan of protest, revealing a stone stairway descending into darkness. Hamish fetched his torch and descended carefully, Lugs refusing to follow and taking up a worried vigil at the entrance. The ice house was exactly as he remembered from childhood explorations, a circular chamber carved into the hillside, walls thick stone, floor packed earth. Empty except for some rotting wooden shelves and the smell of damp and decay. No body, no evidence that anyone had been here in years. Hamish stood in the cold darkness, feeling foolish. He was chasing shadows, seeing mysteries where there were none, refusing to accept that sometimes the obvious answer was the correct one. Perhaps Leonard Boyd had simply walked into the river on Christmas Eve, weighted down by guilt or grief or whatever demons had driven him to seek out his ex-wife's grave. Perhaps his body would surface in spring, and Blair would be proven right, and Hamish would have wasted weeks pursuing phantoms. He climbed back up the stairs and secured the door as best he could without the padlock. The sun was setting, painting the loch in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful if Hamish had been in any mood to appreciate them. As he walked back toward the village, he passed Ruth Calder's bed and breakfast. Lights glowed warmly in the windows, and through one he could see Ruth herself setting a table for dinner, moving with her characteristic efficiency and grace. She glanced up and saw him, smiled and waved. Hamish waved back automatically. A woman who'd lost her sister 20 years ago and had built a new life in the place where that sister had died. A woman who was helpful and kind and thoroughly respectable. A woman who might also be a murderer, if only Hamish could prove it. But proof required evidence, and evidence was precisely what he did not have. Chapter 7. The Helpful Hostess. 3 days into the new year, Hamish received an unexpected visitor. Detective Sergeant Palmer had driven up from London, claiming he wanted to see the Highlands in winter, but clearly driven by curiosity about the case that had occupied their telephone conversations. "You were right to be suspicious," Palmer said, warming his hands around a mug of tea in the police station. "I dug deeper into Leonard Boyd's background, and it makes for ugly reading." Lugs, who had taken an immediate liking to Palmer, sprawled across the detective's feet with proprietorial satisfaction. "Tell me," Hamish said. Boyd was brilliant at finding hidden assets, but he was not above using what he found for leverage. There were at least 3 cases where he was suspected of blackmail, though nothing was ever proven. His specialty was digging up financial dirt and then suggesting that cooperation would be preferable to exposure. What about his marriage to Evelyn? Palmer's expression darkened. That was the ugliest part. They married young, divorced badly. Evelyn accused him of emptying their joint accounts and hiding the money offshore. She tried to prove fraud, but Boyd had covered his tracks too well. The court ruled against her, and she was left with nothing. And then she came to Loch Duby, apparently trying to start over. But here's the interesting bit. Before she died, Evelyn had hired her own investigator to prove Boyd had perjured himself during the divorce proceedings. She believed she had found evidence that would reopen the case. What happened to that evidence? Disappeared when she drowned. Her sister Ruth spent years trying to find it. Convinced that Leonard had somehow caused Evelyn's death and stolen the evidence. But there was never any proof he had even been in Scotland at the time. Hamish felt the pieces shifting again. So Ruth believed her sister was murdered. More than believed, she was obsessed with it. Contacted police multiple times, hired private investigators, made herself quite unpopular with the authorities in Aberdeen. Eventually she gave up, or appeared to give up, and moved to Loch Dub. 5 years ago, yes. I checked the property records. She bought the bed and breakfast with money inherited from her maiden aunt. Set herself up in the very village where her sister died. Waiting, Hamish said quietly. Waiting for what? For Leonard Boyd to come back, which he did, using a false name, asking questions about the past. Palmer nodded slowly. You think Ruth recognised him and took her revenge? I think it's a strong possibility. The problem is proving it. After Palmer left, promising to keep digging into Boyd's affairs, Hamish decided it was time to learn more about Ruth Calder herself. He started with the simplest approach, asking questions around the village. The Curry sisters, never ones to miss an opportunity for gossip, were happy to discourse on Ruth's arrival in Loch Dub. Such a lovely woman, Jessie said. Came here 5 years ago and just fit right in. Fit right in, Nessie echoed. She said she wanted a quieter life after working in hotels for so many years, Jessie continued. We thought it was wonderful, someone with proper hospitality training opening a bed and breakfast. Did she ever mention why she chose Loch Dub specifically? Hamish asked. The sisters exchanged glances. Now that you mention it, Jessie said slowly. I remember thinking it odd at the time. She said she had visited once many years ago and fallen in love with the place. Many years ago, Nessie repeated. When was this visit? She did not say exactly, but I got the impression it was 20 years or more. 20 years. The time of Evelyn's death. Ruth had come to identify her sister's body and had returned to buy a business and settle permanently into the place where that tragedy had occurred. Hamish thanked the sisters and walked to the kirk, where the parish records might hold more answers. Vermund Morrison was happy to let him examine the burial ledger for Evelyn Boyd's funeral. The entry was brief: burial plot purchased and paid for by Miss Ruth Boyd of Aberdeen, service conducted by Reverend Morrison's predecessor. 7 mourners in attendance, none named in the register. "Do you remember the funeral?" Hamish asked the minister. "I was not yet in Lochdupe at that time. My predecessor, Reverend MacDonald, conducted the service. He passed away 8 years ago, I am afraid." But Archie MacLean might remember. Hamish found the fisherman at home, nursing a cold and a dram in equal measure. "Yeah, I remember the funeral," Archie said hoarsely. "Small affair. The sister was there, a few locals who felt it proper to attend. The sister was distraught, blamed herself for not visiting Evelyn sooner, for not realising her sister was in distress." "Did she mention the ex-husband?" "Now that you ask, yes. She said he had destroyed Evelyn's life and that she would never forgive him. Strong words spoken over an open grave." "Did she say anything else?" Archie's rheumy eyes focused on Hamish. "She said something that stuck with me, though I did not understand it at the time. She said, 'He will pay for what he has done. If not in this life, then I will see to it in the next.' I thought it was just grief talking, but looking back it sounded more like a vow. A vow made 20 years ago, finally fulfilled when Leonard Boyd walked back into Ruth's life." Hamish spent the afternoon piecing together Ruth's movements on Christmas Eve. The Grahams had said she returned to the bed and breakfast around 9 o'clock. She claimed to have telephoned Agnes at 11:30. That left 2.5 hours unaccounted for, not the 2 he had initially thought. He walked the route again, timing it carefully. 15 minutes to Agnes's cottage. If Ruth had gone there after the Grahams retired, confronted Leonard Boyd, killed him, and then disposed of the body, she would have needed at least an hour, probably more. But she had made that telephone call to Agnes at 11:30. Agnes had confirmed it, heard the wireless playing carols in the background. Unless the call had not been made from Ruth's parlour at all. Hamish felt a small shock of realisation. Telephones were portable now. Ruth could have taken a cordless phone anywhere. Could have called Agnes from Agnes's own cottage while standing in the very room. But that would mean Agnes had not been home to receive the call. Where had she been? He found Agnes at Ruth's establishment again. The 2 women having apparently formed a friendship born of the shared trauma of Leonard Boyd's disappearance. They were baking together, the kitchen warm with the smell of fresh scones. "Mrs. Pettigrew," Hamish said carefully. "The telephone call you received from Mrs. Calder on Christmas Eve. You're certain you were at home?" Agnes paused in her kneading. "Of course I was home. Where else would I have been?" "And you heard Mrs. Calder's wireless in the background?" "I did. She was playing carols. Why are you asking these questions, Hamish?" Ruth, he noticed, had gone very still, her hands motionless on the rolling pin. "Just confirming details," Hamish said. "Mrs. Calder, you still have the same wireless in your parlour?" "I do," Ruth said evenly. "The same one I have had for 10 years. Might I see it?" Something flickered in Ruth's eyes, too quick to identify. "Of course, though I cannot imagine why you need to." The wireless in Ruth's parlour was an old-fashioned model, the sort that needed to warm up before producing sound. Hamish examined it carefully, then asked, "May I turn it on?" "By all means." He switched it on and waited. The machine hummed, glowed, and finally produced sound. BBC Radio Scotland playing an interview programme. "You must have had this on the classical music station on Christmas Eve," Hamish said. "For the carols." "I did," Ruth agreed. "And yet when I telephoned you yesterday to arrange this visit, you were listening to this same station, BBC Radio Scotland." "I enjoy the variety," Ruth said, but her voice had lost some of its warmth. Hamish knew he was on to something, but could not quite grasp it. The wireless, the telephone call, the timing, something did not fit. It was only later, walking back to the police station with lugs, that it struck him. Ruth's wireless was old enough to need warming up. If she had only turned it on to provide background noise for the telephone call to Agnes, Agnes would have heard the machine starting up, the initial hum and static before the music began, unless the wireless had already been playing, unless Ruth had left it on deliberately, creating the illusion she was at home when she might have been anywhere, including Agnes's cottage, making a telephone call from there while Agnes was out briefly, perhaps taking rubbish to the bins or other momentary errand. It was thin, circumstantial, and would convince no court. But Hamish was becoming increasingly certain that Ruth Calder had killed Leonard Boyd, and that she had done so with careful planning and considerable skill. The question now was how to prove it before she realised he was close to the truth. Chapter 8. What the Snow Hid. Hamish spent the next day re-examining every assumption he had made about the case. The problem with clever criminals was that they planned for obvious lines of investigation, creating neat explanations that satisfied surface inquiries while hiding deeper truths. He began with the river evidence. The hat and wallet had been found downstream, suggesting Leonard Boyd had drowned. But a drowning victim should have surfaced by now, even in winter. The loch was not deep enough or cold enough to prevent a body from eventually rising, which meant the river evidence was deliberate misdirection, planted to suggest an outcome that had never occurred. He walked to the spot where Archie had found the hat, examining the reeds and rocks with fresh eyes. The current here was minimal, barely enough to carry a leaf. For a hat to drift this far, it would have needed to be placed in the water much farther upstream, at a point where the flow was stronger. Hamish followed the riverbank up toward its source, lugs bounding ahead with enthusiasm born of the mistaken belief that this was a pleasure walk rather than an investigation. About a quarter mile from where the hat was found, the river passed behind Ruth Calder's bed and breakfast. There was a small bridge here, ornamental more than functional, crossing a section where the water ran swift and deep between stone banks. Hamish stood on the bridge looking down at the dark current. This was where the hat had entered the water. He was certain of it. From here it would have drifted downstream to be conveniently discovered, creating the impression of an accident or suicide. But why plant evidence suggesting drowning if the body was not in the river? The obvious answer was to buy time, to keep investigators searching the water while the actual crime scene remained undisturbed. And where was that crime scene? Hamish walked to Ruth's bed and breakfast, his mind working through possibilities. Ruth had claimed to be out briefly on Christmas Eve, delivering baking to the kirk. He checked with Reverend Morrison, who confirmed that a tin of shortbread had indeed been left in the church kitchen, though he could not say precisely when it had been delivered. The Grahams had retired early that evening around 9 o'clock. They would not have heard anything that occurred afterward, especially if it had happened in a part of the house away from their room. Hamish studied the building's layout. The bed and breakfast had been a substantial private home before Ruth converted it. The main house contained the guest rooms and Ruth's living quarters, but there was also a separate kitchen at the back, a large room that in the Victorian era would have been the domain of servants. Ruth used this kitchen for preparing guest meals. It was isolated from the rest of the house, with thick stone walls that would muffle sound. A perfect place for a confrontation. Hamish needed to examine that kitchen, but he could not simply demand access without revealing his suspicions. He decided on a more subtle approach. That evening he presented himself at Ruth's door with a basket containing a bottle of whiskey and some locally made cheese. "A small thank you," he said when Ruth answered, "for all your help with the investigation. I know it has been a difficult time." Ruth's smile seemed genuine, though Hamish noticed a wariness in her eyes. "How thoughtful, Hamish. Will you come in for a dram?" "I would not want to impose." "Nonsense. I insist." She led him to her private parlour, a comfortable room with the wireless he had examined, before sitting on a sideboard. As she poured drinks, Hamish noticed a photograph on this mantelpiece, 2 women, clearly sisters, standing beside a loch with mountains in the background. "Is that Loch Dubh?" he asked, gesturing to the photograph. Ruth's hand paused fractionally. "Yes, that was taken many years ago during a holiday." "Your sister?" "Yes." Ruth's voice was steady. "She died shortly after that photograph was taken. A boating accident." "I am sorry for your loss." "It was a long time ago." Ruth handed him his drink. "One never truly recovers from such things, does one?" They talked of inconsequential matters, but Hamish's attention was on the house itself, noting the layout, the sounds from the kitchen, when Ruth excused herself to fetch more ice. The walls were indeed thick, the kitchen quite separate. When he left an hour later, he was more convinced than ever that Leonard Boyd had died in that kitchen. But conviction was not evidence, and evidence was what he desperately needed. The breakthrough came the following morning quite by accident. Hamish was checking the rubbish collection points around the village, a mundane duty that nonetheless needed doing. Behind Ruth's bed and breakfast he found the usual bins awaiting collection. On impulse he opened one and looked inside. Household rubbish, food waste, the normal detritus of running a business. But beneath a bag of potato peelings he found something that made his pulse quicken. A heavy iron frying pan, its handle wrapped in newspaper. He pulled it out carefully, examining it in the morning light. The pan was clean, scrubbed thoroughly, but there was a small dent in the base. The sort of mark that might be made by striking something hard or someone. This could be nothing. People discarded cookware all the time, but the timing was suggestive, and the thorough cleaning suggested someone had been very careful to remove all traces of whatever the pan had been used for. Hamish wrapped it carefully in a plastic evidence bag from his car and took it back to the police station. A call to the forensics laboratory in Inverness confirmed they could test it for blood traces, even if the pan had been cleaned. Though if it has been through a dishwasher, we might not find anything, the technician warned. Test it anyway, Hamish said, while he waited for results. He returned to the problem of where Leonard Boyd's body might be hidden. He had checked the ice house and found it empty. Where else in Lochdup could someone conceal a corpse for over a week? It was Lugs, ironically, who provided the answer. The dog had developed an obsession with the old ice house, returning to it repeatedly during their walks, sniffing around the door and whining. "What is it, boy?" Hamish asked, watching the dog's agitated behaviour. Lugs pawed at the ground near the entrance, whining more urgently. Hamish knelt down and noticed something he had missed during his first visit. The earth here had been disturbed recently, then covered with snow that was now melting. He fetched a shovel from the police station and began to dig. About 2 feet down, the shovel struck something that was not earth or stone. Hamish's heart sank as he cleared away more soil, revealing dark plastic sheeting. He did not need to unwrap it to know what he had found. The shape was unmistakable, and the smell, faint but present even in the cold, confirmed his worst suspicions. Leonard Boyd had been here all along, buried in a shallow grave just outside the icehouse door, hidden by snow and the assumption that the building itself had been the hiding place. Hamish sat back on his heels, looking at what his investigation had uncovered. He felt no triumph, only a profound sadness. Ruth Calder had waited 20 years for revenge, had built a new life while nursing her grief and anger, and had finally taken that revenge when Leonard Boyd walked back into her world. But revenge, Hamish knew, never brought the peace its seekers imagined. It only added more tragedy to what had come before. He telephoned Strathbane for the forensics team and then, with heavy heart, walked to Ruth Calder's bed and breakfast. She answered the door with her usual smile, but when she saw his face, the smile faded. "You have found him," she said quietly. "Aye," Hamish replied. "I have found him." Ruth nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had always known would come. "I suppose you'd better come in then. There are things I should explain." As Hamish stepped inside, he wondered if any explanation could truly justify what had been done, or if the cycle of loss and vengeance had simply claimed another victim in its endless, bitter turning. Chapter 9: The Truth Revealed. Ruth Calder sat in her parlour with the composure of someone who had long prepared for this moment. She poured 2 cups of tea with steady hands, as if this were merely another social call, rather than the end of everything she had built over the past 5 years. "I knew you would work it out eventually," she said, handing Hamish his cup. "You're more thorough than Detective Chief Inspector Blair, thank goodness. I could not have borne being caught by that man." Hamish accepted the tea but did not drink. "Why did you do it, Ruth?" She was silent for a long moment, gazing at the photograph on the mantelpiece. "Do you know what it is like to watch your sister destroyed by someone who claims to love her? Leonard Boyd did not just divorce Evelyn, he systematically dismantled her life, stole everything she had, and then had the audacity to claim she was the unstable one." "Tell me what happened," Hamish said quietly. Ruth took a sip of her tea, gathering her thoughts. Evelyn married Leonard when she was 23, full of hope and dreams. He seemed charming, successful, attentive, but after the wedding she discovered what he really was: a manipulator, a thief, a man who saw relationships as opportunities for profit. He took her money, everything. They had a joint account, investments he persuaded her to make, property purchased in both names. When the marriage failed, Evelyn discovered it had all been transferred into offshore accounts hidden behind shell companies. She tried to prove fraud, but Leonard had covered his tracks brilliantly. The divorce court ruled against her, and she was left with nothing. Ruth's voice remained steady, but her eyes held a pain that 20 years had not diminished. Evelyn came here to Lochdoub to start over. She was writing a book trying to rebuild her life, but she had also hired an investigator, a good one, who had found proof that Leonard had perjured himself during the divorce. She was going to reopen the case, get justice at last. What happened to that evidence? Disappeared when she died. Leonard claimed he had been in London at the time and his alibi appeared solid. But I always knew he was responsible somehow. Perhaps he paid someone to tamper with her boat, or perhaps he came here in secret. I could never prove it. But I knew. Hamish leaned forward. "So, you moved to Lochdoub and waited." "I moved here because it was the last place Evelyn had been happy, before everything went wrong. I wanted to be close to her, to understand why she had chosen this place. But yes, I also hoped that one day Leonard might return. Men like him cannot resist revisiting their triumphs." "And when he did return?" Ruth set down her teacup with precision. "I recognised him immediately, despite the false name and the silver hair. He came to my bed and to breakfast on Christmas Eve, bold as brass, asking if I had rooms available. When I said I was fully booked, he asked about other accommodations. I suggested Agnes Pettigrew. You sent him there deliberately. I wanted to keep him close, to watch him. I telephoned Agnes and suggested she might take in the stranded gentleman, knowing she would appreciate the company. It gave me time to think, to plan." "What did he want in Lochdoub?" Ruth's laugh was bitter. "The same thing he always wanted. Profit. He had learned somehow that Evelyn's evidence still existed, that it had been hidden here before her death. He was searching for it, asking questions about old houses and former residents. He wanted to destroy the last proof of his crimes. And you could not let that happen. I could not let him desecrate Evelyn's memory any further." On Christmas Eve, after my guests retired, I walked to Agnes's cottage. I knew she took her rubbish out at precisely 9:30 every evening, a habit you could set a clock by. I waited until she came out, then slipped inside through the front door, which she never locked during her brief trips outside. Hamish pieced it together. "You confronted Leonard in the guest room." "I told him who I was, that I knew why he had come. He laughed, Hamish. He actually laughed and said Evelyn had been a fool to trust anyone, that the evidence had burned with her boat and that I was wasting my time in trying to prove otherwise." Ruth's composure cracked slightly. "He said she had probably killed herself out of shame for being so easily manipulated." "What did you do?" "I struck him. I did not plan to. But when he said those things about Evelyn, something broke inside me. There was a heavy pan on the sideboard in the hallway, one Agnes used for her cooking. I picked it up and swung it at him. He fell, hit his head on the bedpost. I think that was what actually killed him, not the blow from the pan. And then," Ruth took a shaky breath, "I panicked. I had not intended to kill him, but he was dead and I was standing over his body. I knew I had to hide what I had done. I packed his suitcase with his belongings, took his boots and coat. I carried him out through the back door while Agnes was still at the rubbish bins, loaded him into my car and drove him to the ice house. Why the ice house? I remembered it from when I identified Evelyn's body 20 years ago. I had walked all over the village in my grief trying to understand what had happened. I knew the ice house was abandoned, forgotten. I thought I could hide him inside, but when I tried the door, the padlock was rusted shut. I could not break it without making noise, so I buried him just outside instead, in the frozen ground. And the evidence in the river? I drove to the bridge behind my property and threw his hat and wallet into the water, letting the current carry them downstream. I thought if everyone believed he had drowned, they would search the river and eventually give up when no body was found. You called Agnes from her own cottage. Ruth nodded. I brought my cordless phone with me. After I had hidden Leonard's body and planted the evidence, I returned to Agnes's cottage. She was back inside by then in her parlour. I stood in her hallway and telephoned her landline from my mobile, pretending to call from home. I had left my wireless playing so she would hear music in the background. She never suspected I was calling from just a few feet away. The simplicity of it was almost admirable. Ruth had created a perfect alibi using nothing more than careful timing and Agnes's predictable habits. "What about the Grahams?" Hamish asked. "They said you returned home around 9. "I did. I had delivered the baking to the Kirk earlier, as I said. But I went out again after they went to bed, around 9:30. The old dears sleep soundly, and my car is parked at the back of the property. They never heard me leave or return." Hamish studied her face. "You planned this very carefully." "Not the killing itself. That was impulse rage, grief finally exploding after 20 years. But the cover-up, yes. I had thought about what I would do if Leonard ever returned, how I might make him pay for what he did to Evelyn. When the moment came, I was prepared." "Did you find the evidence Leonard was searching for?" Ruth smiled faintly. "There was no evidence, Hamish. It burned in Evelyn's boat, just as Leonard said. My sister died with nothing but her own certainty that justice existed somewhere in the world. She was wrong about that. And now? Now you will arrest me and I will stand trial for murder. I do not regret what I did, Hamish. Leonard Boyd destroyed my sister's life and probably caused her death. He deserved what happened to him." "That was not your decision to make," Hamish said gently. "Perhaps not, but it is done, and I would do it again." Outside, Hamish could hear vehicles arriving, the forensics team from Strathbane coming to process the scene and recover Leonard Boyd's body. Soon Blair would arrive, ready to take credit for solving the case. The machinery of justice would grind forward, as it always did. Ruth stood and straightened her cardigan. "Shall we go outside? I would prefer not to be arrested in my own parlour if it is all the same to you." Hamish stood as well. "Ruth Calder, I'm arresting you for the murder of Leonard Boyd. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court." As he led her outside into the cold January morning, Ruth paused to look back at her bed and breakfast, at the life she had built while waiting for revenge. "I was happy here, you know," she said quietly. "For 5 years I had peace. I wish it could have lasted longer." "So do I," Hamish said, and meant it. Because sometimes justice and tragedy were so intertwined that separating them was impossible, and all anyone could do was witness the sadness of it all. Chapter 10. A Silent Christmas Resolution. The arrest of Ruth Calder was conducted with as much discretion as possible in a village the size of Lockdub, which is to say that within 2 hours everyone from Archie MacLean to the Curry sisters knew every detail, embellished with considerable speculation about what they had suspected all along. Detective Chief Inspector Blair arrived in a fury that Ruth had confessed to Hamish, rather than waiting for his own investigative brilliance to expose her. He spent 20 minutes bellowing about proper procedure before Detective Jimmy Anderson quietly reminded him that the case was now solved and that the press would be very interested in hearing about the successful resolution. This transformed Blair's mood entirely. He immediately began planning the press conference at which he would reveal how his careful supervision had led to the breakthrough. With perhaps a small acknowledgement of Macbeth's minor contributions, Hamish let him bluster. He had no desire for publicity and even less interest in Blair's version of events. The case was solved, Ruth was in custody, and Leonard Boyd's body had been recovered for proper burial. That was sufficient. Agnes Pettigrew took the news with characteristic stoicism, though Hamish could see the hurt beneath her composed exterior. She had welcomed a stranger for Christmas, and that kindness had led to murder in her own home. "I should have known something was wrong," she said when Hamish called to check on her the day after Ruth's arrest. "When Mr. Barrington, or Boyd, or whatever his name was, asked all those questions about finances and old residents, I should have seen it." "You could not have known," Hamish assured her. "He was skilled at deception, and Ruth's planning was meticulous. No one could have prevented what happened. Ruth seemed such a good woman. We had become friends, or so I thought." "Perhaps you were friends in her way. Her quarrel was never with you, Mrs. Pettigrew." Agnes nodded slowly. "That makes it worse, somehow. To think she was using me, my home, while pretending friendship." Hamish could offer no comfort for that particular wound. Betrayal of trust was something that healed slowly, if at all. The villagers' reaction to Ruth's arrest was more complex than simple condemnation. Many felt sympathy for her, understanding the long grief that had driven her to murder. The Highlands had a particular view of justice that sometimes diverged from legal niceties, and the story of Evelyn Boyd's destruction at Leonard's hands resonated with those who valued family loyalty above all else. "The man had it coming," Archie MacLean said flatly when the topic arose at the Lockdoub Arms. "What he did to that poor woman, stealing everything and leaving her with nothing. Aye, Ruth should not have killed him, but I can say he did not deserve a reckoning." Others were less forgiving. Morag Sinclair, still shaken by having been a suspect herself, declared that murder was murder regardless of provocation, and that Ruth should face the full weight of the law. The Curry sisters, naturally, had opinions on both sides and expressed them with equal vehemence, often in the same conversation. "Such a tragedy for poor Ruth," Jessie would say. "Poor Ruth," Nessie echoed. "Though of course murder is terrible," Jessie would add. "Terrible," Nessie agreed, "but that Leonard Boyd was a dreadful man." "Dreadful?" Hamish listened to it all with weary patience, knowing that the village would debate and dissect the case until some new scandal came along to claim their attention. What troubled him most was not Ruth's guilt, which was clear, but the waste of it all. Leonard Boyd had destroyed lives for profit and died for his cruelty. Evelyn Boyd had sought justice and found only death. Ruth Calder had nursed her grief until it poisoned everything she touched, and now she would spend years in prison for a revenge that brought no peace. 3 lives ruined, and for what? Money, pride, and a justice that could never truly be achieved because the dead stayed dead and the past remained unchanged. He discussed this with Dr. Dalrymple one evening over a dram at the doctor's cottage. The old physician listened thoughtfully, then offered his perspective. "You cannot save everyone, Hamish. Some people are determined to destroy themselves, whether quickly or slowly. Ruth Calder chose her path 20 years ago when she vowed to make Leonard Boyd pay. Everything that followed was inevitable. Could I have prevented it if I had worked faster? You solved the case in less than 2 weeks, with minimal resources and that fool Blair hampering you at every turn. No one could have done better. And even if you had arrested her the day after Boyd disappeared, it would not change what she did or why she did it." "I suppose not," Hamish said, though the weight of the case still pressed on him. "What will happen to her?" "She will stand trial. Her confession makes conviction certain, though her solicitor may argue diminished responsibility given the provocation and her history. She might receive a reduced sentence, and then she will serve her time and eventually be released, if she lives that long. She is 53 now. By the time she is free, she will be an old woman with nothing but memories of what might have been." It was a grim prospect, and Hamish could find no comfort in it. The weeks that followed brought a return to normalcy. The snow melted, revealing winter grass and muddy lanes. The case faded from the headlines as other dramas claimed public attention. Life in Loch resumed its gentle rhythms. Agnes Pettigrew recovered her equilibrium and announced she would never again take in unexpected guests. Christmas charity be damned. The Curry sisters found new topics to discuss. Archie McLean returned to his fishing, and Morag Sinclair, to her anxious tending of roses, continued to look dubious. Hamish settled back into the comfortable routine of village policing, checking on the elderly, mediating minor disputes, ensuring that the peace of Loch remained undisturbed. Lugs accompanied him on his rounds, once again the primary focus of his daily concerns. On a mild day in late January, Hamish walked to the churchyard and stood before Evelyn Boyd's grave. Someone, probably Ruth before her arrest, had placed fresh flowers there despite the season. They were wilting now, but the gesture remained. "I hope you found peace," Hamish said quietly to the stone. "Your sister tried to find justice for you, though it came at a terrible price." The grave, of course, offered no reply. The dead kept their own counsel. As he turned to leave, Reverend Morrison approached, having noticed Hamish from the kirk. "A sad business," the minister said. "Aye, that it is. Do you believe in divine justice, Hamish? That those who escape earthly law will eventually face a higher judgment?" Hamish considered the question. "I believe that people make their own hells, Reverend. Leonard Boyd lived knowing what he had done, carrying that knowledge until someone finally called him to account. Ruth Calder lived with her grief and anger until it consumed her. They both found their judgment, whether divine or otherwise." "A practical answer from a practical man," Morrison said with a slight smile. "But perhaps you are right. We create our own prisons long before any earthly court confines us." Walking back to the police station, Hamish reflected on the strange Christmas just past. A stranger had come to Loch seeking something he would never find. A woman had waited 20 years for revenge she could not truly enjoy, and a peaceful Highland village had been reminded that beneath the surface of ordinary life, old griefs and older crimes could still reach forward to claim new victims. The Christmas bells had rung, as they did every year, celebrating hope and renewal. But some wounds, Hamish knew, went too deep for any season to heal. At the police station, he found a note pushed under the door. It was from Ruth, written before her transfer to prison to await trial. "Dear Hamish," it read in her neat handwriting. "Thank you for your kindness during my arrest. You treated me with more dignity than I deserved. I want you to know that I do not regret what I did to Leonard Boyd. He destroyed my sister, and he would have destroyed others given the chance. But I do regret the pain I've caused to Agnes and to Loch You have a good village here, and I was happy to be part of it, however briefly. Please tell Agnes that my friendship with her was genuine, whatever else might have been false. I will miss the Highlands and the peace I found here. Yours sincerely, Ruth." Hamish folded the letter carefully and placed it in the case file. Then he made tea, settled into his chair with Lugs at his feet, and watched the winter afternoon fade into evening. Outside, Loch went about its business, the village enduring as it always had, absorbing tragedy and scandal and emerging somehow intact on the other side. The loch reflected the darkening sky, and smoke rose from chimneys, and life continued in its inexorable way. Another case solved, another mystery laid to rest. But the questions it raised about justice and revenge, grief and redemption, would linger long after the details faded from memory. Such was the nature of police work in the Highlands, Hamish thought. You solved the crimes, but the human heart remained forever mysterious, capable of both great kindness and terrible cruelty, often in the same person. He sipped his tea and let the peace of evening settle over him, grateful for the simple comfort of his station, his dog, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring fresh problems, none of which, with any luck, would involve murder. Though in Loch one could never be entirely certain of that.